All right, let's dive right into it. Today's explainer is unpacking a truly fascinating evolution. We're going to trace the transformation of law, order, and state power in the Indian subcontinent. We'll look at how the idea of a local street thug evolved into deeply entrenched political forces, and ultimately, how the modern state machinery has completely adapted its own tactics to govern and maintain order.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll define the Gonda. Then examine the sheer physical cost of vandalism and break down the legal frameworks around liability. After that, we'll track the rise of the Bahubali and wrap up by exploring how the modern state itself is adopting strongman tactics. So, Section 1, Defining the Gunda and the Etymology of Order. The linguistic history here is actually pretty surprising. The term gunda comes from the Hindi word for rascal, along with identical Marathi roots that go all the way back to the 17th century, basically referring to hired criminals. Now, you might assume it's just a localized version of the English word goon, right? Well, it's actually the exact opposite. The first English language appearance of gunda in British newspapers in the 1920s predates the English use of goon for a criminal. That English usage only goes back to a 1930s comic strip character named Alice the Goon. Pretty wild, right? But over time, the term evolved. It went from just describing an individual thug into a much broader systemic concept that we call Gundaraj, or a Gunda regime. This isn't just a few bad apples. It denotes a criminalized nexus. We're talking about government officials, elected politicians, big business interests, and sometimes even trade unions, all operating together like a mafia. This is the massive systemic level of disorder that the state ultimately has to contend with. Moving on to Section 2, the cost of vandalism and public disorder in action. To really grasp the sheer scale of this challenge, we just have to look at the rapid, widespread succession of stone-pelting incidents specifically targeting the Vande Bharat Express. And this was just in the first half of 2023. It starts in West Bengal in January, hits Karnataka and Murshidabad by March, moves over to Visakhapatnam, down to Kerala, and then all the way up to Uttar Pradesh by June. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It's a geographically massive challenge to public property and order. And the financial toll? It's absolutely massive. According to disclosures made to Parliament in July 2023, the railways incurred a staggering loss exceeding 55 lakh rupees since 2019, just due to these incidents. Putting a hard number on it like that really takes the abstract concept of antisocial behavior and grounds it in undeniable, hard data. That brings us to Section 3. Laws and liability, and the legal frameworks of control. So historically, different regions tried to handle this by enacting specific Gunda acts, and they are all incredibly diverse. Uttar Pradesh, for example, allows for externment, which basically means banishing an offender from a district for up to 6 months. Tamil Nadu takes a really strict approach where a single offense can trigger detention. Karnataka went a totally different route and expanded their definition to include digital data and copyright pirates. But these acts are legally contentious. In fact, Rajasthan's externment provisions were struck down by the High Court in 2001. The court ruled it violated Article 21, the constitutional right to life, because it left banished individuals in a worse state than prisoners who at least get accommodation provided by the state. Beyond those specific Gunda acts, the state also had to figure out how to address mass property damage during protests. Back in 2009, the Supreme Court laid out some foundational guidelines for this. They stated that high courts should set up the machinery to investigate. Crucially, they established strict liability, meaning rioters absolutely must pay compensation once a connection to the incident is proven. But, and this is a big but, the court was very clear. Cost recovery must happen through a formal judicial process headed by a claims commission. It cannot just be done directly by the executive state apparatus. Well, in response to intense protests, Uttar Pradesh enacted a very specific ordinance. The UP Recovery of Damage Act empowered state-run tribunals to decide these claims. It enforced a principle of absolute liability, meaning instigators and participants are jointly held liable. And it allowed the tribunal to literally attach properties and publish the personal details of the accused. However, this highly administrative approach got some serious pushback. In 2020, the Allahabad High Court stepped in and stayed these recovery orders in Lucknow. The court noted that publishing personal details directly violated the right to privacy and life under Article 21. They reiterated that administrative officers simply didn't have the power to issue recovery notices, firmly pointing back to the 2009 Supreme Court ruling that it has to be a judicial process. And that creates a really profound tension. How exactly does a state enforce public order and protect its infrastructure without overstepping the bounds of the law?
It's a tough balancing act, and this precise dilemma is the historical backdrop for the emergence of alternative, highly muscular forms of political power.
Which perfectly sets up Section 4, Rise of the Bahubali, and the shifting locus of power.
To understand this major shift, we need to look at the concept of the Bahubali. Originally, this term actually referred to the Hindu patron deity of the wrestling pit, a kind of ascetic protector. But as the socioeconomic landscape shifted in the post-Nehruvian era, the term totally evolved. It came to denote a political strongman. And it wasn't just about brute violence either. A true modern Bahubali possessed dhanbal, or wealth, jambal, meaning people's support, and buddhibal, or political acumen. They essentially became the new embodiments of social power right at the grassroots level. The old Bahubali playbook was definitely unique. These figures originally popped up as different local castes fought for control over institutions and business contracts. They relied heavily on Shakti Pradarshan, which is basically a spectacular show of strength through street violence. They openly defied the law. Maybe they'd refuse to pay tolls, or they'd roll through town with a crew of armed henchmen, all to demonstrate their total impunity. But to survive long-term, they had to be incredibly savvy political gamblers. They struck electoral alliances and provided crucial resources to their communities just to earn that vital junbal, that people's support.
Let's look at how this evolved in Section 5, the state as strongman, and the modern governance model.
Over the last decade or so, researchers have noted a fascinating shift in places like Uttar Pradesh. We're seeing a transition from the private Bahubali to what analysts are calling the Bahubali state. Think about it. The private strongman relied on gang muscle, needed constant validation through elections, and was ultimately vulnerable to being humiliated by state police. The modern governance model, on the other hand, utilizes official state machinery. It deploys its own spectacular methods, and crucially, it actively aligns the strongman projection of order with massive, big capital infrastructure projects. This modern governance model manifests in some really stark ways. We see a form of instant justice, where the state utilizes bulldozer demolitions against the properties of those simply accused of crimes. We've seen spectacular, highly visible violence, like the live television killing of former strongman Atiq Ahmed while he was in police custody. But this extremely tough-on-crime stance is uniquely paired with an overarching grand vision for the state. It merges strict partisan governance with the construction of massive religious pride corridors, right alongside totally unprecedented budgetary funding for mobility infrastructure, things like metro rails and massive highways. It's a governance model that broadcasts a clear message. It is demolishing the old private criminal networks to make way for massive state-directed development. Which leaves us with this vital, overarching question to think about. As modern governance merges rapid, undeniable infrastructure development with spectacular strongman tactics, what is the ultimate future balance between public order and the rule of law? It's a complex, evolving reality that completely redefines how power is exercised in the modern era. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in today's Explainer. Catch you next time.